Mr. Speaker.
E te ātua kaharawa, ka tuku whakamoemiti atu mātou mō ngā karakia kua waihotia mai ki runga I o mātou. Ka waiho o mātou pānga whaiaro, katoa ki te taha, ka mihi mātou ki te kingi me te inoi atu, mo te ārahitanga I roto I o mātou whakaaroarohanga. Kia mōhio ai, kia whakaitia tā mātou whakahaere I ngā take o te wharenei, mo te oranga, te maungarongo me te aroha Aotearoa. Āmene.
Members, I regret to inform the House of the death on 27 February 2023 of the Right Honourable Paul East, CNZM KC, who was a National Party member representing the Rotorua electorate from 1978 to 1996 and continued to serve as a list member until 1999. During his membership of this House, he was Attorney General, Leader of the House, Minister of Defence and Minister of State Services. I also regret to inform the House of the death on 27 February 2023 of the Honourable Chester Borrows, QSO, who represented the Whanganui electorate for the National Party from 2005 to 2017. During his membership of this House, he chaired the Justice and Electoral Committee and was Minister for Courts, Associate Minister of Justice and Associate Minister for Social Development. He was the Deputy Speaker of the House from 2014 to 2017. I further regret to inform the House of the death on 6 March 2023 of Georgina Bayer, MNZM, who represented the Wairarapa electorate for the Labour Party from 1999 to 2005 and continued to serve as a list member until 2007. She was New Zealand's first openly transgender member of Parliament. During her membership of this House, she chaired the Social Services Committee and was a member of a number of other select committees, particularly the Local Government and Environment Committee and the Law and Order Committee. I desire on behalf of the House to express our sense of the loss we have sustained and our sympathy with the relatives of the late former members. I now ask members to stand with me and observe a period of silence as a mark of respect to their memory. Nō reira tēnā tātou kua whakaaetia au kia tuku atu te reo he waiata.
Wow.
I wish to inform the House that I have received notification from the Rotorua District Council, the promoter of the bill withdrawing the Rotorua District Council Representation Arrangements Bill under Standing Order 279. The bill is therefore discharged from further consideration by the House. Petitions have been delivered to the clerk for presentation.
Petition of Sean Porini requesting that the House create an Ombudsman empowered to oversee any iwi corporation activity. Petition of Kate Day requesting that the House make public transport permanently half price for everyone. Petition of Debbie Port requesting that the House urge the Government to regulate standard user tariffs.
Those petitions stand referred to the Petitions Committee. Ministers have delivered papers.
Annual reports for the Health Quality and Safety Commission New Zealand and Whakaata Māori Television Service. Government response to the report of the Education and Workforce Committee, briefing on the report of undocumented Tuvaluans in Auckland. Framework agreement on the establishment of the International Solar Alliance together with national interest analysis.
Those papers are published under the authority of the House. Select committee reports have been delivered for presentation.
Reports of the Economic Development, Science and Innovation Committee on the 2021-2022 annual reviews of New Zealand Growth Capital Partners Limited, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment and New Zealand Institute for Plant and Food Research Limited. Reports of the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the Budget Policy Statement 2023 and Half-Year Economic and Fiscal Update 2022 and the Taxation Annual Rates for 2022-23 Platform Economy and Remedial Matters Bill No. 2. Report of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee on the 2021-22 annual reviews of the Ministry of Defence and the New Zealand Defence Force. Report of the Justice Committee on the Human Rights Incitement on Ground of Religious Belief Amendment Bill. Reports of the Petitions Committee on the petition of the Breast Cancer Foundation New Zealand, petition of Catherine Bindon, petition of Natalie Horspool, petition of Sarah Rowland and the petition of Victor Wellington. Report of the Regulations Review Committee on the COVID-19 Public Health Response Self-Isolation Requirements Amendment Bill, Order No. 2, 2022.
The bills are set down for second reading. The Budget Policy Statement is set down for consideration and the report of the Regulations Review Committee is set down for consideration. The clerk has been informed of the introduction of a bill.
St Peter's Parish Endowment Fund Trust Bill, introduction.
That bill is set down for first reading. The House comes to oral point of order. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to correct an answer to a supplementary question that I gave with regard on Wednesday the 22nd of February in answer to question number 5.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? Appears to be none.
Mr Speaker, in one of my answers to a supplementary question from David Seymour in response to the question concerned, I said that government tax revenue as a proportion of GDP had declined under this government. It hasn't.
The House comes to oral questions. Question number 1 in the name of Christopher Luxon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads, does he stand by all of his government statements and actions?
Well, most of them. Mr Speaker, yes, except for the ones that I've corrected.
Is it still government policy to, quote, reduce the reliance on expensive consultants and contractors, saving taxpayers many millions of dollars a year, quote, as he promised in 2018?
Mr Speaker, it remains the government's position that the public service should be sparing in its use of consultants and contractors. Where there is a justified case for using them, then the public service should do that. But I do still continue to believe that there is too much use of consultants and contractors to do work that the core public service could do.
Given that answer, when should taxpayers expect to see the, quote, many millions of dollars in savings, given consultant spend has ballooned to $1.7 billion on his watch?
Mr Speaker, I'd encourage the member to have a look at more detail about the nature of that increase. The nature of that increase, much of that was one-off and justified in the circumstances. Around a third of that expenditure, for example, is related to IT expenditure, which, as the member will know, is a consultant-led industry. A significant proportion of it related to COVID-19 related expenses, such as the rollout of the vaccines, which the member and his party argued we didn't do fast enough.
When he told media this morning he had sent government departments a memo on consultant spending, quote, many times over the last 5 years, quote, Did he ever stop and ask himself why his memos were being so blatantly ignored?
Mr Speaker, I know that one of the reasons that we've seen an increase in recent years, it was to do with the issues that I have just raised, and it was justified in the sense that we have had to replace a number of IT legacy systems. That is a consultant-led industry. Another area of significant growth has been in building and construction, where we are doing more capital works than the previous government did, and I absolutely stand by that track record.
Did Michael Wood get the memo when he spent $51 million on consultants for a cancelled bike bridge and $53 million on consultants for a non-existent light rail?
Oh, Mr Speaker, it's clear that not everybody got the memo. For example, I'm aware that the chair of the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council spent money employing consultants to write the one substantive report the council managed to come up with.
Yeah. Did Andrew Little get the memo when, according to Rob Campbell, he had over 200 comms staff but still had to call on expensive PR consultants to sell government policy?
Mr Speaker, the health reforms are the biggest set of reforms to the health system in a generation. It is important that we got the right people doing the right work.
Did Chris Hipkins get the memo when he spent $21 million on consultants for the failed Polytech reforms?
Mr Speaker, I don't regard the Polytech reforms as failed. And in fact, one of the reasons the opposition might regard them as failed is that we have record numbers of New Zealanders in apprenticeships, which is something that they failed to do. In fact, the number of people in apprenticeships under National went down.
Isn't it the truth that the government has hired an extra 14,000 public servants while in office, whose main job appears to be hiring, recruiting, managing and paying for consultants?
Mr Speaker, if the member wants to refer to increased social workers who deal with some of our most vulnerable children in that way, if he wants to refer to the extra people working in corrections to ensure that we are doing a better job of rehabilitating prisoners, if he wants to talk about the people who work on the front line at MSD, getting people off benefits and into work in that way, then he could do that. If he wants to talk about the speech and language therapists that work directly with kids to improve their educational outcomes in that way, then of course he can continue to do that.
Question number 2, Anna Law.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Cyclone Recovery. What actions has the government undertaken to support the recovery from the recent extreme weather events?
Mr Speaker. The Honourable Grant Roberts.
Mr Speaker, the government is continuing to take action quickly to provide certainty and assurance for those communities and regions affected by the devastating impact of the cyclone and of flooding. More than $400 million of additional support has been committed so far. Yesterday, we added $26 million to the fund that is successfully helping farmers and growers with post-cyclone cleanup, taking total primary sector support to date to $55 million. The full cost of the impact of the recent weather events is still to be determined. We do know that it will be considerable and there will be further significant resources needed to support New Zealanders through the response, recovery and rebuild phases. The government is committed to working with local communities to get affected families, farmers and businesses back on their feet and their regions moving.
What reports has he seen on support to assist the primary sector in response to the cyclone and floodings?
Mr Speaker, as I said, the additional $26 million boost announced yesterday will help farmers and growers re-establish their businesses, particularly in the wake of Cyclone Gabrielle. This is on top of the initial package of $25 million and the $4 million for rural community recovery funds that have been available. Some 3,128 applications have been received so far for grants, and already more than $18.2 million has been paid out to farmers and growers.
How will the government's business support package assist small and medium-sized businesses in response to the extreme weather events?
Mr Speaker, there is an additional $25 million support package which we announced last week to help businesses meet immediate costs, further assist with clean-up and boost business support and advice services. The grants of up to $40,000 per businesses will be delivered by local delivery partners, as they know the people on the ground and are best placed to do this. We acknowledge that further allocations to businesses may be needed after this initial funding. The delivery partners are currently receiving applications, and as at this morning, that stood at 1,966 applications.
What other support is available to businesses to support the recovery?
Mr Speaker, along with the grants schemes, funding has been provided to the Employers and Manufacturers Association to extend the reach of their employer helpline. We've also provided additional support for the Regional Business Partner Network to increase the amount of business advice that they can offer. And the First Steps program has been opened up and expanded so that mental health support can be provided to those on the ground who need it. Mr. Speaker, we know that there are also larger businesses who are facing costs that go beyond what this initial emergency funding can support. We are working directly with them to understand their needs and how we can support them, and we will have more to say on how we will help them get it back on their feet soon.
How well placed is New Zealand to deal with the consequences of extreme weather events?
Mr. Speaker, New Zealand is in a strong financial position to support our country through these challenging times. This in part is thanks to the careful and prudent management of our books by this government. We know, however, that the Crown accounts will change significantly in the coming months and years as the impact of the cyclone and flooding becomes clearer, and our approach may need to change in response to this. If further resources are required, we are in a good position to manage that. The economy has been resilient in a challenging global environment with unemployment near record lows, and our debt level sits at 18.9% of GDP, well below our debt ceiling and among the lowest in the OECD.
Question number 3, David Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads, does he stand by all his government's statements and actions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes.
Can he assure the House that his government never discussed using fear to scare New Zealanders into complying with COVID-19 restrictions? And if so, would he be comfortable with a journalist having all the former COVID-19 ministers' internal communications, just like journalist Isabel Oakeshott has former British Health Secretary Matt Hancock's?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's an absolutely ridiculous question. It was never discussed in any of the ministerial meetings that I was part of or in any of the conversations that I had around our COVID-19 response.
Will he then ask the former COVID-19 minister to publicly release all of his texts, WhatsApp messages, emails, memos, and other internal communications about COVID-19 to ensure New Zealanders that they did not discuss using fear to get New Zealanders to comply with COVID-19 restrictions?
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the member that the former Minister for COVID-19 response, like all government ministers, will comply with their obligations under the Official Information Act.
Does he agree with the statement in the Transport General Policy Statement that, quote, many New Zealanders will need to adjust their behaviours in a variety of ways? And if so, can he say which New Zealanders need to adjust which behaviours?
Mr. Speaker, there is no question that we need to get serious about reducing our carbon emissions, and that is going to involve some New Zealanders all thinking about how to reduce their own carbon emissions.
Was his Transport Minister, Michael Wood, strongly promoting that general policy statement at 7 a.m. yesterday morning, then jamming it hard into reverse and backing down on the policy by 3 p.m, an example of a, quote, New Zealander adjusting his behaviour in a variety of ways?
Mr. Speaker, I reject the premise of the member's question.
Supplementary, the Honourable Michael Wood.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that the government has not in fact issued a government policy statement on transport, nor has Cabinet in fact considered one at this stage?
Mr. Speaker, the member is absolutely correct.
Supplementary. Does the Prime Minister stand by the Minister of Education's statement to Morning Report in September that she would absolutely not make tests easier to help students pass them? Or the new Minister of Education's statement today asking, is testing the best way to find out what our young people know? I would actually argue that not for every young person that is the case. I know that's not the best way to find out what our young people know. Which statement does the Prime Minister stand by?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I think the member is unduly simplifying both of the statements in question. There is no question that the former Minister of Education was absolutely committed to ensuring that we were raising standards when it came to issues around literacy and numeracy, a goal I know the current Minister of Education absolutely shares.
Does he agree with former Education Minister Chris Hipkins, who said the government's education policy was to, quote, ensure our young people continue to have access to a world-class education, end quote? If so, does allowing students to use spell check because 66% of them failed a writing test, fit with this government's aspirational vision of a world-class education?
Mr Speaker, if the member had listened to my previous answer rather than sticking to his script, he would know the answer to that question.
I don't think the Prime Minister wants it. Which action does he most stand by? The Human Rights Commission's campaign, quote, "Give Nothing to Racism," or Creative New Zealand giving $107,000 to support somebody who says they want to, quote, "kill James Cook, his descendants and white men like him with a pig hunting knife because, quote, "they too might be thieves," end quote?
Mr Speaker, that's a message, that's a question for Creative New Zealand, who make those decisions independently of government.
Is he aware that the government appointed the Creative New Zealand board who decided to fund that production? And if he is, why shouldn't the government appoint board members committed to giving nothing to racism too?
Mr Speaker, I'm absolutely aware that the government appointed that board, as all previous governments did as well. It doesn't mean that every government endorses every decision that's taken in the name of art.
Question number 4, Nicola Willis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he stand by his statement, quote, "We have a responsibility as government to ensure taxpayer dollars are spent wisely," and does he think all government expenditure in the past 5 years has represented good value for money?
The Honourable Grant Robertson.
Speaker, I do stand by that statement. In answer to the second part of the question, I'm proud as Minister of Finance to have invested in the core public services that New Zealanders depend upon. This includes 10,000 new public housing places, 4,000 more nurses, 2,900 more teachers, while investing in schools and hospitals and protecting the lives and livelihoods of New Zealanders in response to a once-in-a-century event like COVID-19. Our approach has also delivered for New Zealand record low unemployment, low public debt compared to the countries that we normally compare ourselves with, and a larger economy than before COVID. The government has also reprioritised and refocused spending as the circumstances require, ensuring we continue to be responsible managers of the government's finances. In particular, our decisive response to those affected by Cyclone Gabrielle has meant more than $400 million of funding has already been allocated to those most in need.
Did the Minister receive the memo the Prime Minister allegedly issued urging constraint in public expenditure on consultants and contractors? And if so, how much has been spent on consultants and contractors to help design the now shelved New Zealand Income Insurance Scheme?
Well, Mr Speaker, in answer to the second part of the question, the member wants to put down a specific question like that. I can get it for her. I think the majority of the spending on the New Zealand Income Insurance Scheme would have been funding to have MB and ACC do the work, but there may well have been some consultancy expenditure. In answer to the first part of the member's question, as the Prime Minister has already indicated, those expectations are clear.
Why is the Minister of Finance not aware that the scheme he specifically urged be designed has so far cost New Zealand taxpayers $10.3 million worth of consultants and contractors? And how can that possibly represent good value for money when one of the first things the new Prime Minister did was bin it?
Mr Speaker, the work on the New Zealand Income Insurance Scheme, in the words of the Prime Minister, is important to make sure we fill a gap in our social security system. I get it that the member doesn't care about people who get made redundant and doesn't care about people who lose their jobs through health conditions and disability. We will continue to fill that gap, but as the Prime Minister has indicated, in the current economic environment, we have chosen to deprioritise it.
Is the Minister aware that his own agency, the Treasury, in 2022 spent $8.2 million on consultants and is forecasting that this year, 2023, it will up that considerably to $12 million.
Mr Speaker, as has already been traversed in question time today, our expectation on government agencies is that they use consultants when they need to and when they have to, and not when they don't need to and they don't have to. What I would also say to the member, though, is it's very easy for a government not to spend money. That's when it doesn't do anything. That's when it doesn't address long-term issues like our water infrastructure. That's when it doesn't do the work to improve schools and hospitals. That's when it doesn't do the work to look after after our transport networks. So by all means, if the member wants to say that the National Party would never spend any money on consultants and contractors when they were office, do that, but that would be a continuation of a do-nothing national government.
That's right. Done nothing in 6 years.
Does the Minister consider the government is getting good value from its spending on consultants and contractors, when it seems one of the markers of failure is just how big the bill for consultants is? For example, the TVNZ-RNZ merger with a bill of 10 million, or the Three Waters scheme, fatally flawed with a bill for 26 million so far.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased the member raises the Three Waters scheme, because the member will be well aware that the kinds of issues being dealt with when it comes to Three Waters are ones where it is essential to bring in experts to do that. Again, I know that the member's approach would be to completely ignore the quality of our water, would be to make sure that New Zealanders' rates bills go higher than they need to. It's completely possible to sit on your chuff and do nothing about water infrastructure. This government's not prepared to do that.
You just changed the name.
Can the Minister see that it is very hard for New Zealanders who are struggling through a cost of living crisis to understand why their money should be spent on consultants for projects that the government has now shelved? And is it the case, to borrow a phrase from the Prime Minister, that his party has now become a consultant-driven industry?
Mr Speaker, in answer to the second part of that question, no. In answer to the first part of the question, we will continue to support New Zealanders through the cost of living crisis with policies that I know the member opposes, but that actually lift people's incomes and lift people's wages, and that will continue to be our priority. When we're in government for a period of time, from time to time, there will be reprioritisation, there will be issues that need to be changed. The member might be familiar with a sheep farm in the Saudi desert. Not every piece of spending a government does ends up quite the way you want it.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a document. It is an Official Information Act response from the ACC confirming 10.3 million has so far been spent on consultants and contractors for the income insurance scheme.
But I'll deal with this, thank you. What's the date on, sorry?
3rd of March 2023.
And is it publicly available?
I didn't understand that to be the case, but it could be.
Can anyone enlighten? Okay, well, you go. I'll put the leave. Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? Appears to be none. It may be tabled. Question number 5, the Honourable Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe te manga o te whare. My question is to the Minister for Oceans and Fisheries. Is protecting more of Aotearoa New Zealand's oceans from overfishing a priority of his? If not, why not?
The Honourable Stuart Nash.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Absolutely. Ensuring that New Zealand's fish stocks are sustainable and our marine environment is healthy are both high priorities of mine.
What actions, if any, is he taking to ensure New Zealand fulfils its commitment to protecting 30% of the oceans by 2030 under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework agreed to by government last December?
Mr Speaker, I'm no doubt that member is well aware that we currently have about 9.5% of our territorial sea and marine reserves, and in addition to that, we protect over 30% under a variety of protection measures.
Does he believe New Zealand needs to step up efforts on ocean protection in light of the recent international agreement to protect 30% of the high seas by 2030? If so, will he stop issuing permits for New Zealand vessels to bottom trawl in international waters in the South Pacific?
Mr Speaker, that isn't a measure that I have considered, but I firmly believe that New Zealand's global brand is wedded to the way that we fish our fisheries in a sustainable manner. It's one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of putting cameras on fishing boats. It's not just about the integrity of the catch, it's about the brand value that we sell overseas.
In the light of his concern about Aotearoa's New Zealand's global brand, is he concerned that bottom trawling in New Zealand waters creates risks for our seafood exports to overseas markets in the light of last year's ban on importing fish caught in Maui dolphin habitat by the United States Court of International Trade? And if not, why not?
Well, Mr Speaker, the member is also well aware that there is a bottom trawling forum that's been set up with NGOs and also representatives from the fishing industry. I have seen the recommendations. Needless to say, they all agree that things need to change, but they're a little bit far apart in terms of their recommendations. In terms of the Maui dolphin ban, I was quite surprised with regard to that, and no doubt the former Minister of Conservation was herself, because I was the Minister of Fisheries and that member was the Minister of Conservation when we put a number of measures in place to protect the Maui dolphin habitat.
Will he act to protect our oceans for future generations and ban bottom trawling on seamounts in our waters? And if not, why not? And when can we expect action on the recommendations of the group?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm yet to consider those recommendations. I have read them, but I need to respond. As mentioned, the forum set up did contain NGOs, it did contain the industry. There are a series of recommendations. In the end, they couldn't agree, but they all agreed that things needed to change. I think that's a very good start.
Can New Zealanders expect to see any progress before the election to update and replace our 50-year-old marine protected area legislation? Why not?
Mr Speaker, I'll be meeting with the new Minister of Conservation, and we'll be talking about a number of things. I've always been clear that I think it's a priority to move forward with our marine protected areas, but whether we do that under legislation before the election is something for the Minister, probably the Minister of the House, to consider.
Question number 6, Dr Shane Reti.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Health, how many contracting or consulting arrangements has Te Whatu Ora made with contractors or consultants since 1 July 2022, and how many of these arrangements were for public relations or communications advice?
The Honourable Dr Aisha Verrill.
Mr Speaker, a number of health services are delivered under contracts, including all-age residential care services, primary care services, most laboratory services and community health services. In addition, capital works projects engage contractors. However, in terms of Te Whatu Ora's national functions, I am advised that up to 2 March 2023, it has commenced 343 new contractors or consultants since 1 July 2022. Of those, 26 new contractors or consultants since 1 July 22 are for communications, engagement and public relations activity in its national functions. Te Whatu Ora does not have available data on new district-level contracting or consulting arrangements and does not currently have a single payroll system or central register of consulting arrangements yet. I am advised Te Whatu Ora has established a contractor and consultant workforce review to improve data on this workforce and is focused on decreasing spending on contractors and consultants.
Supplementary. Which is correct. The answer she has just given, that there are 343 new level contract arrangements, or her answer to written question 43274 from a few weeks ago, that there are 626 new national level contracting arrangements.
I took the member's question today, I paid attention to the member's question today, and its reference to arrangements made with contractors or consultants since 1 July 2022. To mean only brand new contracting or consulting arrangements made by Te Whatu Ora in the timeframe. The 343 does not include contracts which were already in place or given an extension.
Does she stand by her answer to written questions that the Ministry of Health has spent $21 million on consultants in just the first 6 months of the health reforms? And if so, can she name one of her health indicators that have improved for the $21 million?
Mr Speaker, the purpose of the health reforms was to reorientate our system towards one in which we can make sure that services are available locally, that there is no longer a postcode lottery for services, and where Māori health is elevated and pursued actively through Te Aka Whaiora. Those are the goals of the reforms. During that time, the Ministry of Health made lots of progress on keeping the country safe from COVID, on contact tracing monkeypox to eliminate outbreaks. There have been Mr Speaker, the ongoing work with the reforms will bear fruit over time.
Point of order, the Honourable Michael.
Mr Speaker, that was a very interesting answer, but neither of the two legs of that supplementary question were answered. One was, can she confirm $21 million, and can she point to a single health indicator that's improved? The long commentary did not address either of those legs.
Yeah, I disagree. I believe that I disagree. I think the overall statement that the Minister did addressed the overall question. Now, if the member wants a specific answer, one leg.
How does she justify the $2.2 million within the Māori Health Authority budget this year just for PR consultants that she stated in answer to written questions?
Mr Speaker, Te Aka Whai Ora is a new part of our health landscape. It has to make sure that the public understands what its job is to do and indeed with the misinformation that it is subject to. I've been pleased to be out with Te Aka Whai Ora in the community, drawing attention to the good work they're doing.
Question number 7, Shannon Halbert.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Question to the Minister of Transport. What recent reports has he seen regarding the rollout of emergency Bailey bridges following Cyclone Gabrielle?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr Speaker, the Government has deployed and is looking to deploy Bailey bridges across 10 sites in the North Island to reconnect isolated communities impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland floods. Bailey bridges have already been installed at Rangi Te Puni Stream in Riverhead, Raparapa Hoi Stream in Te Puki, and Opo Iti Bridge in Wairoa. Design work and site preparation is underway for Bailey bridges to be installed at Risington Bridge, and Waikeri River Bridge in Hastings, and Hikawai No. 1 on State Highway 35 in Tairāwhiti. We'll continue to work with local councils to identify where Bailey bridges could helpfully restore essential transportation links, and are currently assessing the suitability of sites in Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti for further Bailey bridges. The quick rollout of these Bailey bridges has been enabled by the dedicated work of contractors on the front lines, as well as the Government's $250 million top-up to the National Land Transport Fund. I want to thank all of the road workers, engineers and support staff who have been on the ground to get these critical connections restored for our communities.
Are there enough bridges in the country to meet the needs of affected communities?
Mr Speaker, yes there are. We have a number of bridges in reserve and will look to source more from overseas if required. Waka Kotahi are also still working through suitability assessments for potential sites to determine how many additional bridges and equipment may be needed, depending on individual site conditions.
Supplementary. Where Bailey bridges aren't the right solution for restoring a transport link, what other tools are available to reconnect communities?
Bailey bridges are only one of the tools that we're using to reconnect communities in the short term, and they're not always the right solution. That's why Waka Kotahi are working through a range of other options to help restore those connections, including diversions through private property, providing temporary single-lane access, and using speed or weight restrictions on existing bridges as an interim measure. As we work through suitability assessments, we'll have a clearer idea of what resources are best suited to meet community needs, and at all times we'll work closely with local communities and local councils to prioritise their needs as we restore access.
How does the rollout of Bailey bridges figure in the Government's broader plan for repairing transport networks in the response to the cyclone?
Mr Speaker, the scale of the damage in the rebuild means that it will take some time, so we're tackling the rebuild in 3 stages. The first stage, and our very top priority right now, is getting lifeline roads open and reconnecting isolated communities. Once we're confident all communities are reconnected and lifeline routes are open, we'll move on to the second stage of the rebuild. This stage will be focused on getting more permanent solutions in place for affected areas. The final stage of the rebuild will be adding resilience into our transport network. We need our infrastructure to endure in an era of dramatic climate change, and after seeing the impact of the last few weeks on our transport network, we know there's more work to do to ensure that it's up to that challenge.
Question number 8, Erica Stanford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Education. Does she agree with the reported statistical analysis carried out by the New Zealand Council for Education Research into the NCEA literacy and numeracy pilot that found that the assessments performed well? And does she stand by her statement in September that she is absolutely not considering making the tests easier?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Jan Tinetti.
Yes and yes.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Why then, just 1 month after she said she is absolutely not making the tests easier, did the Ministry of Education officials write to NZQA requesting that they use easier words, fewer questions, and let students use a spell check.
Mr Speaker, because I expect that my officials consider all evidence that's put in front of them. I also expect experts in their fields would disagree on evidence and analysis from time to time. I expect robust discussions to happen between agencies in this area.
Supplementary question. Is spelling a foundational literacy skill, and does allowing the use of spell check to assess basic foundational literacy make the literacy test easier or harder?
Mr Speaker, the member is referring to a document, some advice that was given through to a document. That is not advice that I have personally read. It may have been sent to my office in a no surprises before the release, but I have not personally seen that, so I cannot comment on it.
Supplementary question. Given the answer that the Minister just gave to this House, shouldn't she be aware of her official's advice going to NZQA, and who is running the Ministry of Education? Is it her or her officials?
Mr Speaker, as I've said, I expect the experts to work through that information, to have those robust discussions. Final advice hasn't come through to me at this stage. I await that further advice.
Question number 9. Dr. nzherald.co.nz.
Whawhai lava, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Health, how is the government supporting mental well-being for people affected by the cyclone?
Mr Speaker, last week I announced an additional $3.2 million in reprioritised funding to support the immediate wellbeing needs of people impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle. The personal recovery for those who have lost loved ones, livelihoods and homes to Cyclone Gabrielle is going to be incredibly tough. This government will continue to stand alongside those in New Zealand experience hardship, and they will make sure they're not doing it alone.
Supplementary. What services will be available to people impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle?
The funding allows for an expansion of the All Sorts Mental Wellbeing campaign, which supports communities with tools to look after each other's wellbeing. We're bringing in a team of mental health workers to offer local support to those most impacted by the cyclone, and Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority, is designing a Māori-led response to support Te Ao Māori mental wellbeing solutions.
Supplementary. What specific measures are being taken for isolated communities?
We are supporting isolated communities in a number of ways. As well as free face-to-face services, we are also supporting a range of free telehealth and digital services for those unable to travel to services. There have been pamphlets hand-delivered along with aid by Civil Defence in the worst affected areas. The pamphlets include information on free wellbeing supports that are available and wellbeing tips for those cut off from all communication. There is also additional mental health staff arriving in Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti to take pressure off local providers and ensure that current and emerging needs are met.
How does this additional funding support the existing mental health programs?
Mr Speaker, over the last 5 years, we have built the primary mental health care system from the ground up. Over 2.6 million people are now covered through primary care providers, and over 670,000 sessions have already been delivered. In Hawke's Bay, since Cyclone Gabrielle, those working in the primary care mental health service have been making proactive calls to people who are isolated or have long-term conditions, checking on welfare and normalising conversations about emotions and mental well-being.
Question number 10, Simon Court.
Mr Speaker, to the Minister of Transport, what reports, if any, has he seen on whether New Zealanders supported his draft government policy statement, which could have reprioritised annual road maintenance funding towards bus lanes and cycleways? And has he been advised that New Zealanders would prefer to see that money spent on repairing potholes across the state highway network?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr Speaker, in the first instance, I reject the characterisation in the member's question. The government has not issued a draft government policy statement on transport. Cabinet has not considered a draft government policy statement on transport. and nor have officials even completed the exercise of writing a draft government policy statement on transport for me to finalise and to send to Cabinet. Secondly, the member is wrong that the government has or will reprioritise road maintenance investment. In fact, our government has increased road maintenance investment by approximately 50% over the levels that were in place under the previous National Act government. And thirdly, I reject the member's view that our transport system should not invest in transport choices for New Zealanders, such as the North Western busway improvements that member has previously expressed support for. In a climate crisis, we need to invest in repairing the network after the devastating storms recently. We need to build a resilient network for the future, but we also have to invest in the choices that will help to reduce carbon emissions in a climate crisis.
Supplementary. Why then, at 7 a.m. on Monday, did he defend the plan to reprioritise up to $2 billion per year of road maintenance funding into cycleways and bus lanes at the expense of car parks and traffic lanes, but then announced at 2 p.m. the plan would instead focus on resilience?
Mr. Speaker, the member is entirely mischaracterising my comments. The documents that the member is referring to was guidance which was sent to local government in late 2022, which set out key government priorities as we move into the government policy statement period of consideration in 2023. That included a strong focus on maintenance, it included reducing emissions, and it included a focus on resilience. The member is probably aware that in January and February of 2023, large parts of the North Island experienced devastating weather events which have caused huge damage to the transport network. We will invest through the GPS in doing all of the things that are important. We will invest in rebuilding that network. We will continue to increase our maintenance, but we will also invest in those measures which will reduce our emissions. I know for some on that side of the House, taking action on climate change is not something that they support, but it's something that our government is committed to.
Supplementary.
Look behind.
Was it the effects of Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle that led to the Minister realising that transport network resilience was important enough to do a U-turn on his draft GPS? Or was it the overwhelming public rejection of his attempt to force people out of their cars in the hours after his appearance on Mike Hosking's breakfast show that led to the U-turn?
Mr. Speaker, the rhetoric from the member in his question and some others at this time, as we are committed to rebuilding the transport networks of devastated areas in which they set up a false choice between supporting the recovery in regional New Zealand and investing in climate-friendly infrastructure is a false choice. It is ignorant of the challenge that we face in respect of reducing our emissions. It is divisive, and it is not one that will find favour for New Zealanders. New Zealanders expect us to invest in restoring the network. That's why we invested $250 million to make sure that we get road and rail connections restored. But New Zealanders also expect us to look to the future and invest in reducing our emissions so that our kids and grandkids don't face more devastating events like the ones we've just experienced.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was the Minister aware that Waka Kotahi in 2020 published a document identifying 40 extreme and 143 major resilience risks to the state highway network? And if so, why does he prioritise the ideological projects like an Auckland Harbour bike bridge, light rail, and forcing people out of cars and onto cycles and walking?
Mr. Speaker, once again, the member sets up a false choice between investing in a resilient network and investing in climate-friendly infrastructure. I'm certainly aware of that information provided by Waka Kotahi, and that is why, as I said, our government has increased investment in the maintenance of our network by 50%. Between 2016-17 and 2021, we increased investment in state highway maintenance in the Gisborne area by 90%, in the Hawke's Bay by 62%, and in Northland by 117%. But at the same time, we'll take the advice from Waka Kotahi, the Independent Climate Commission and others that we urgently need to give people transport choices to reduce congestion and emissions in our growing urban centres. Again, I note that the member, when it suits him, supports investments like the North Western busway improvements, but then for the sake of cheap politics, sets up this false choice in this discussion.
Supplementary. Is the Minister aware that ACT has published 15 urgent ideas from recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle? And will he commit to using this guide to come up with some ideas to reprioritise funding towards rather than away from resilience in the transport network?
Mr Speaker, I'm certainly aware of that document and some of the ideas within it. One that I'm aware of is the proposal to reduce the real wages of minimum wage workers. And if the other ideas are as stupid and callous as that, I won't be paying it any attention at all.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Simon Court.
The question was quite clear. Is the Minister going to commit to reprioritising funding towards rather than away from a safe and efficient transport system as described in this document?
No, I think I don't need that. No, you are the master of your own answer. You brought in the document and the Minister responded to it. Question number 11, Nacy Chen.
Happy Census Day, Mr Speaker. To the Minister for Statistics, what actions has the government taken to ensure that Census 2023 meets its goals and objectives?
Speaker.
The Honourable Deborah Russell.
Mr Speaker, today is Census Day. Our 5-yearly census is taking place this month and we aim to count everyone who is in New Zealand on the night of 7 March 2023. This year, for this census, government has doubled the number of census collectors with more assistance to complete the census. Census collectors will be employed for longer, so doing more with more people. 44% of all dwellings have received paper forms before Census Day. There is more assistance to complete census forms, with 30% of households supported at or over the doorstep to complete census forms.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I want to hear the answer to this, so dial it back.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, David Seymour.
Speaker, I think what some members were pointing out is that a member was apparently videoing or photographing the Minister giving the answer, which I thought was in contradiction of standing orders.
Well, it is, but that's not the point of order that I just, the issue that I just dealt with. So what is your point?
I was just trying to be helpful, Mr Speaker. There was a member who apparently videoing the answer being given by the Minister.
Is that right?
And I think that's what members were barracking about, trying to draw your attention to it without disrupting the question and answer.
Okay. Is there a member who was filming during the answer of that question?
Yes.
Pardon?
Photographing.
Photographing.
Yep.
And you know the rules? You're going to delete them now?
Sure. And I apologise.
Speaker, I'm delighted to see the level of engagement with this question. And in fact, that's something we've done in Census 2023. There is much more engagement with communities to support awareness and participation in the census. And we have focused on working directly with community and treaty partners to help deliver the census. As my census badge says, tato tato, all of us count.
True.
Order. Supplementaries are heard in silence.
What is different for Māori in this year's census?
The Speaker, this year in some areas of the country, the collection of census data is being led by iwi. In Te Tai Tokoro, Tairāwhiti, and with Te Whānau o Apanui in the Bay of Plenty, data will be collected by iwi and shared with the census team. And it will be easier for all Māori to identify iwi affiliation with a new iwi affiliation map, and there are twice as many census engagement staff than there were in 2018, with more than half being Māori.
Supplementary. What is being done to ensure minority groups are counted?
Yeah. The census team is holding assisted completion events, going out into libraries and community halls and attending community events to help people complete their census forms. Special events have been held for particular communities, such as a community event for young disabled people in Takapuna last week, and a gathering for the Kiribati community in Auckland.
Supplementary. When can people do the census?
Mr Speaker, this year's census has been open since the 9th of February, and over 1.5 million individual forms have already been submitted. And of course, there are plenty of people who, rather than doing in advance, like to do the census actually on Census Day. That is today. So anyone can do the census any time from now. And the important thing is that when people do the census, they base it on where they are tonight, the 7th of March.
Supplementary. What impact have the Auckland anniversary weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle had on the census?
Mr. Speaker, the extreme weather events have had a significant effect on Census 2023. Census activity has gone ahead as planned in most parts of the country, but in areas that have been deeply affected, dispatching census packs has been delayed until communities are ready to receive them. The post-census collection period has been extended, and extra help is being put into these areas to ensure that people are assisted to complete the census.
Supplementary question.
New Zealand plan to reconcile the data from the duplicate census papers sent to over 1.5 million New Zealanders? And does she believe this will affect the census data quality?
Mr. Speaker, of course, each census pack contains multiple copies of the census form in order that multiple members of a household may complete the census. The member, however, may have been referring to the second letter that was sent to many households to remind them to complete the census. This was done because in field testing in 2022, it was found that there was a much greater response rate from households if a second reminder letter was sent.
Question number 12, Samir Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transport. Does he stand by his proposal which could divert road maintenance funding to building cycleways? If not, why not?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr. Speaker, the government has not and does not intend to divert road maintenance funding. As I've already said in the House this afternoon, our government has in fact increased road maintenance funding by 50% after it was frozen for 8 years under the previous National Act government. I'll note again that we've increased state highway maintenance funding by 90% in Gisborne, 62% in Hawke's Bay and 117% in Northland, and I expect us to continue to invest increased levels of investment in state highway maintenance over the coming years.
Supplementary. What happened yesterday between 7:05 a.m. when he was defending the government's plan to use road maintenance funds to build cycleways and 4 p.m. when he was forced to publicly abandon his plans?
I reject the multiple assertions in the member's question. What the member is referring to are long-standing requests from local government and from communities, in fact, that the government tries to get better bang for its buck out of its transport investment. For example, if a piece of maintenance work is being done on a piece of state highway, but we know that at the same time that piece of state highway should have additional safety infrastructure such as side or median barriers, it makes sense to use that maintenance program to also invest in the safety infrastructure, something that hasn't happened to date. The same can apply to, for example, to investing in public transport infrastructure in growing areas at the same time as we're doing maintenance work. Most people would just call that common sense.
Did he receive a memo from the Prime Minister stating that his proposal to divert road maintenance funding to build cycleways and bus lanes was no longer compatible with the Prime Minister's intention? And if so, when did he receive it, or is it still on the bike bridge?
No, Mr. Speaker, but I have seen a memo from Waka Kotahi warning that the 8 years of frozen maintenance funding under the previous national government was leading to a significant degradation of the state highway network.
Is it correct that the price that the Minister had to pay to get Chris Hipkins to support his $30 billion Auckland Light Rail project was that he would be kept out of the loop on transport funding in other areas?
Mr. Speaker, at a time when the country expects us to make long-sighted decisions to build a resilient, low-carbon transport network, I would imply all members to engage in that discussion with seriousness. There are opportunities for debates about relative priorities within the system, but the members' consistent approach of just playing cheap politics with our transport system does him and his party no favours and does not advance the debate. I also note that that member, when it suits him, supports government investment in public transport, such as the Eastern Busway we're building to his electorate, but seems to want it to stop it from happening in any other part of the country.
Point of order, the Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Mr Speaker, it appeared in answer to the second supplementary question that the Minister was quoting from an official document, and if so, under standing orders, it would be appropriate to have that document tabled.
Can the Minister confirm whether or not he was?
Just to seek clarity, is that in the previous supplementary question where I referred to a memo from Waka Kotahi? Yes, Mr Speaker, I'm happy to table that in accordance with the usual procedures.
Very good. You don't need leave, you can just... that concludes oral questions. I call on Government Order of the Day.
Interrupted debate on the Prime Minister's statement and the amendment proposed to it.
I call Steph Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for the opportunity to continue my contribution in support of the Prime Minister's statement. Before I begin, though, I do want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the passing of the Honourable Chester Burrows, former MP for Wanganui between 2005 and 2017. Chester was one of those MPs who was respected and admired by MPs right across this House, and especially by our communities in Wanganui and Taranaki. I also want to acknowledge the passing of Lindsay Patterson, who was a renowned glass artist in Wanganui. His passing has been keenly felt by our arts communities. Mr Speaker, when I started this speech last week before recess, I was talking about the support that our government has provided our primary producers who've been impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle. At that time, our total support amounted to $29 million. Since then, however, Mr Speaker, I think it's important to note that the total package is now $55 million to support our primary producers to rebuild and recover. Mr Speaker, that means that about $17.4 million has already been paid out to the over 2,800 applications that we've received for support. We know that more is needed, and MPs on the ground like my colleague Anna Lork, Stu Nash, Meka Vaitari, they're all there providing feedback from the affected communities. Mr Speaker, I also began to talk about the support that we're providing our families from the 1st of April. We've extended the fuel excise tax and road user subsidies through to the end of June, and I know that this makes a huge impact to our families in the community. I recently rode the Tide bus, a new bus service in Wanganui, which cost me $1.20 thanks to government subsidies to get from the suburb of Gonville all the way into town. It's initiatives like this that are having a huge impact on our families and individuals to be able to get into town and participate in their communities through challenging times. We're also increasing Best Start. At the same time, 54% of families with children will become eligible for additional subsidies for early childhood education. We're increasing superannuation and benefits. 1.2 million adults are going to receive an increase to the winter energy payment, and I've heard from many across my electorate how much of an impact that's going to have on them. So, Mr Speaker, we are here for those people who are finding it tough during these challenging times. Our government continues to be focused on those bread and butter issues that all Kiwis care about. We are committed, Mr Speaker, to helping everyone through these challenging times, and I'm proud of the work that we are doing to support Kiwis. One more thing I'd like to note, Mr Speaker, is the reinstatement of the training incentive allowance and how that has been exceeded expectations. A 600% increase in those applying to receive support through the training incentive and allowance. And I'll never forget a young mum I spoke to on the doorstep during 2020 who said to me how much of a difference that is going to make in her life to be able to build a better future for her and her children.
Thank you.
So that is incredible support that people in my electorate are so grateful to receive. We've also supported almost 55,000 people through trades training and through the Apprenticeship Boost Scheme. Our Mana e Mahi program has supported over 5,000 job seekers into jobs, which has well exceeded our target and hopes of 4,000. As I said, Mr. Speaker, these are challenging times, but we are really focused on those bread and butter issues that we hear time and time again on the doorsteps that New Zealanders care about. That includes our families and our primary producers. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Grant Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, I too want to begin my contribution today by acknowledging, as the House did earlier on, the passing of three former members, the Right Honourable Paul East, the Honourable Chester Burrows and Georgina Beyer. All three of them made significant contributions both to this Parliament and in their communities. I do particularly want to acknowledge my friend Georgina Beyer. She was the voice for the voiceless. She always approached every issue that she came across with extraordinary courage and bravery. I stood with her on the steps of Parliament the day that Brian Tamaki's Enough is Enough march arrived here, and I watched with a mixture of awe and genuine fear for her safety as she decided to go down and confront them face to face, but only Georgina could have pulled it off in the way that she did, and I was in awe of her bravery that day, as I was on a number of other occasions. I do remember during the prostitution reform law reform campaign that she began one of her speeches in one of the debates by saying, "I'll take the liberty of assuming that I'm the only member of Parliament with experience of prostitution." And then she paused and she looked across the chamber, and a few people looked away, Mr. Speaker, at that point. Georgina's life was full of drama, some of it scripted, some of it unscripted. She was a wahine toa. She was a person of activism, of creativity and of araha, and I, along with many, many others, will miss her greatly. Moi mai rā e te wahine rangatira. Mr. Speaker, I rise with great pride to speak on the Prime Minister's statement debate. Mr. Speaker, I am proud of a government that through a series of challenging crises and moments in our history that we never thought we would see, has been able to prioritise looking after our people. Because, Mr. Speaker, that is the fundamental job of a government. When we've come to a time of crisis, people look to the government to step forward for them. And that is happening again today as we deal with the outcomes of Cyclone Gabrielle and as we deal with the flooding that we saw in Auckland and Northland earlier this year. Mr. Speaker, those communities have been devastated. And I know members from across the House have been in those communities, have been working alongside those who are doing it tough, and I want to acknowledge all of those MPs. But I also want to acknowledge the communities themselves who have stood up for themselves and for their people. I want to put on record again today that as we have done in the past, as we did with COVID, and as we will no doubt have to do again in the future, we stand with those communities. This will be a locally led response, because that is the right thing to do. And it will be a time where central government works with local government, with iwi, with our communities, with businesses, with workers, to make sure that these regions get back on their feet. This will not be a short journey, Mr. Speaker, but it will be one where the government will be with New Zealanders all the way. Just, Mr. Speaker, as we are with those New Zealanders who are dealing with cost of living pressures. And right around this country, we see communities who have been affected by, for example, the rising cost of food, by the pressures of inflation that are seen right around the world. And, Mr. Speaker, the government has consistently put how we support people with their day-to-day expenses at the front of mind. And I think about initiatives like our school lunch program. Mr. Speaker, this was something that at the time we introduced it, there was criticism of. There was criticism, was this the responsibility of the government? And we can debate. Well, Mr. Goldsmith, again, I really don't think you want to be contributing when it comes to a discussion about how much things might cost or where we might get the money from, and I'll come back to you in a moment, Mr. Goldsmith. But on school lunches, Mr. Speaker, we know for sure that this is now making a difference in the way in which children learn. in the way in which they are able to be at school not worried about where their food comes from. And time and again, Mr Speaker, I travel around New Zealand and I hear from school principals, I hear from parents about the importance of that to making sure that not only are we supporting whānau with the cost of living, but also that we are making sure that students are able to learn. We've done the same thing with the support that we gave through COVID and then through the cost of living payment. And Mr Speaker, I am proud that on the 1st of April we will be able to additionally support people who are on working for families, who are on main benefits, who are in receipt of superannuation. If I get one piece of feedback, Mr Speaker, it's about the winter energy payment, Mr Speaker, and that will come into force again from the 1st of May. And that is a payment that makes sure that our older New Zealanders can stay warm through winter and those on low and middle incomes can be supported. I'm proud that the minimum wage has been lifted, Mr Speaker, consistently by this government, because those who are raising a family on a minimum wage deserve to know that that will increase and they will be able to meet the costs that they are facing. And so, Mr Speaker, when we see that, when we see things like the Best Start initiative, again, started by this government, which from the 1st of April is going to go to increase to $69 a week, we know that we are doing the right thing. That's why, Mr Speaker, we've extended out the fuel excise duty, the road user charges, because we know that the cost of the cuts to those, because we know that the cost of living is still that pressure. And we've got to get on top of the long-term issues that sit behind that. That includes making sure that we do have genuine competition in our supermarket sector to lower the price of food that people are facing. That we have used the inquiries done by the Commerce Commission to keep an eye on the margins that we have within our fuel sector. Mr Speaker, these are the things that a government does when it's interested in making sure that we support those who are facing pressure from the cost of living. But, Mr Speaker, one of the things that I've learned as Minister of Finance over the last 5 years is that we have to make sure we know how we're going to pay for things, Mr Speaker. And while I would welcome Mr Goldsmith wants to debate the 2020 figures, as he calls them. Well, Mr Goldsmith, if he's yet picked up the bit of paper that he dropped that fateful day, will discover that his numbers did not add up. And that's the tragedy, Mr Speaker, is this week the National Party is making the same mistake again that it made when Mr Goldsmith was in charge of their financial portfolio. Because we're pleased to note that the National Party has seen that early childhood education is a priority, Mr Speaker. That is a good thing. I welcome the fact that all parties in this Parliament, I hope, would believe in that. But, Mr Speaker, it's a little late to the party, for the National Party, given that they froze some of the funding rates in there when they were in office. But my bigger concern here is that the National Party at the weekend announced a $1 billion policy. $1 billion in our forecast year. Yet every single thing they've put up as a way to pay for this is something that's already been expended. Now, I know the National Party might be looking at changing a few ways that they're doing things, but going back and getting money from people who've already been paid it by the government probably isn't in their list, although who knows when it comes to Mr Goldsmith. And the question that they've got to answer now, the National Party, is where does the $1 billion come from? Because they haven't answered that question up to this point. And unfortunately, there is now a danger that the National Party again fall into Paul Goldsmith's fiscal Bermuda Triangle, because they always like to tell us that they'll be able to reduce debt, that they'll be able to cut tax, but they'll be able to fund a $1 billion policy somehow whilst doing those two other things. That was the failure of the National Party in 2020, and it's pretty disturbing, Mr Speaker, to see over the last few days that the National Party has decided that once again they're going to be into that fiscal Bermuda Triangle. So the question for the National Party remains, what gets cut? Because something's going to get cut along here. There isn't actually baseline expenditure here that they can pull out. So they're going to have to find something. And is it going to be the people who help design our roads? Or is it going to be the people who look after our water system? Or is it going to...
Mr Robertson, we've got about a minute 30 left. I'd like you to spend at least that time. I'm aware you were responding to comments across the House, but can we just go back to the Prime Minister's statement?
Oh, Mr Speaker, with pleasure, Mr Speaker, but I do think it's important when members opposite decide that they want to get on their high horse that they justify themselves. And so I look forward to a National Party Speaker telling us where the $1 billion will be cut from. Mr Speaker, one of the bits of the Prime Minister's statement that I particularly want to draw people's attention to is the investment of this government in infrastructure. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of is that when we came into office, we inherited an infrastructure spend of around about $5 billion a year. We've lifted that up to $9 billion a year. It goes up to $12 billion a year on average from next year. Mr. Speaker, that is the funding that builds our roads. That is the funding that builds 10,000 public housing places. That's what builds new schools. That's what builds our health services that were so sadly neglected by the previous government. That investment in building our nation for the future is something that I'm both proud of and I am looking forward to doing more of over the coming months. Mr. Speaker, we must look after our people. Our people come first and they always will for a Labor-led government. But at the same time, we have to plan and build for our future. That is now in the shadow of climate change. That is now in the shadow of the extreme weather events that we've had. And I know, looking at this Prime Minister's statement, that there is a plan to build back better, build back smarter and ensure that New Zealanders have a country that they can be proud of.
The Honourable Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We heard from the Prime Minister, new Prime Minister, in his first press conference that when he was asked the impertinent question about having cancelled the Radio New Zealand TVNZ merger, how much had the government spent on it? And he said, "Oh, I don't want to look backwards." And I have news for the Prime Minister. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. When you're in an election year, a government is accountable for what it has achieved or what it hasn't achieved. And people want to know what has happened with the extra $1 billion a week that this government has been spending since 2017. So that's right, over an extra $50 billion a year is being spent by this government above what the previous national government did, an extra $1 billion a week. And so there's a very perfectly legitimate question that New Zealanders have, what have we got for it? How have our lives been improved by that extra $1 billion a week? How have our lives been improved by the 14,000 odd extra civil servants and by the $1.7 billion on consultants that this government has been spending? And then we look and see, well, how are things better? Well, we've got 7% inflation and most New Zealanders are struggling with the cost of living. And then if we look at the education sector, for example, we say, well, we've got extra billions of dollars going into education. How's that working out? The previous speaker spoke of the free lunches at schools. One of the main arguments for that was to make sure that the kids came to school, so they had lunch at school. And yet truancy rates have got worse and worse and worse under this government, so we've got fewer than half of the kids regularly attending. And we had the Prime Minister, Mr. Fix-It, Mr. Hipkins, Minister of Finance for 5 years, so the kids don't go to school. It's not very reassuring for us, Mr. Speaker. And then the standards of actually learning what they learn at school, whether they can read or write, has gone backwards as well. So that hasn't been a good investment in terms of focusing the public sector and the schools on what they really need to do, which is ensure that the kids are at school and that they measure some progress. If we look at health, what about health? We've got extra billions going into health. And what have we got there? We've got a very large bureaucracy led by a man up until a week ago who was clearly very focused on one issue, which was co-governance, and not much else, because we had much longer waiting times in our prison. So with all the extra money, you go along, are you going to get your emergency situation dealt with quicker? Under all this extra resources under this government? No. You have to wait many more hours in ED on average in order to get seen. So that hasn't improved things. If we look at housing, they said they were going to create 100,000 new houses under Kiwi Build, which was Jacinda Ardern's greatest flop. What's happened there? Well, they've got more and more young families and people living in emergency housing, week after week, month after month, and even year after year. We've got more than 4,000 young children being raised in emergency motel housing, and the Minister of Housing has no real solution. And part of the reason is that they've put up the cost of housing so significantly and had a war on landlords, which has seen people retreat from renting out their houses. It's not compulsory to rent out your houses, and that's added to the pressure on the housing. The housing's added to the pressure on education, and the housing and education combined have added pressure on youth crime, and I'll come to that later. What about transport? We've spent extra billions of dollars, and so the Minister of Transport stands up and says, oh, we've spent so much more on road maintenance, and yet the roads are worse than they've ever been. So what's going on? Why are there so many potholes if we've spent all this extra money, 50% increase on road maintenance? Well, one of the main problems is that so much of the money is spent on road management and cones that very little is actually spent on actually fixing the roads. And that's something that the Minister might look at. But we've seen this incredible increase in spending, and we have not seen a single new significant roading project started. They've finished 2 of the National Party's, one coming north out of Wellington and through the Waikato, which has been transformational for those areas. And they still haven't opened the one north of Auckland after 5 years. They're still fluffing around, and that's one of the great kind of scandals of the day. What on earth has happened? It's been finished for up to a year, and yet it's still not opened. They're still fluffing around, and they used to call that the Holiday Highway. I remember the Labour Party referring to the Holiday Highway. And if you think of what's happened in Northland, what is the most important thing you can do is actually enable people to reconnect with the rest of the country. And this government hasn't continued, has been very slow with that motorway project, and stopped the next leg going around the Brynderwyns, and yet we still have some people suggesting we should move the port up to Whangarei. I wonder how that would work if you have no road and the trains are knocked out. So the basic investment in infrastructure hasn't been happening. Instead, the money has gone into the endless little road bumps all around Auckland and reducing the speed limit to 30. And if that's the limit of this government's ambition, that in a time of life when cars have never been safer, we have to crawl around at 30 kilometres in our city and go over road bumps, that's where all the money's going, and actually investing in road maintenance and helping get people to where they want to go quickly and efficiently is way down the bottom. So billions of dollars extra being spent, worse outcomes in health, worse outcomes in education, and nothing to see for it in transport apart from a promise of a slow tram going down Dominion Road one day. And then if we come to justice, what do we see? Well, the only real justice target that this government has is a 30% reduction in prison population, irrespective of what the level of crime is in our community, which is a bizarre target. We've seen actually a 33% increase in violent crime, and yet the prison population continues to fall because this government is soft on crime. It's also soft on the causes of crime. They've managed to double it, soft on crime and soft on the causes of crime, because they haven't dealt with truancy, they haven't dealt with emergency housing, they haven't dealt with any of the things that drive crime in the long term. So they've been soft on the causes of crime, and then when it comes to crime itself, the only thing that they've done in that area is to repeal the 3 strikes legislation. Why? Because they've looked at the situation, they've looked at the increase in violent crime, they've looked at the 500 increase in ram raids, the sense of disorder on our streets, and they've come to the conclusion that the one thing we need to do is reduce prison sentences for our worst repeat offenders and do away with 3 strikes. What a bizarre outcome. A total joke. And so that's where they're at. They spent most of last year focused on that important issue, hate speech legislation, which in December the Minister stood up in the House and introduced and said, this is great, this is important, this is a priority for us. And then about 4 weeks later, they withdrew it. So that was a lot of consultants' work, no doubt, focused on that this year. They still have on the books reducing the voting age to 16. So that's where their priorities are in justice, on those things, rather than reducing violent crime, dealing with the long delays in courts and doing something effective about youth crime. So what's National doing? And everybody wants to have higher wages. Of course, higher incomes should be the focus of all governments. This government's conclusion is that the way to achieve that is, A, to legislate for higher incomes through minimum wages and all sorts of fair pay agreements and all sorts of things like that. Secondly, it's about reducing immigration, starving off immigration so there's a shortage of workers and wages go up. Unfortunately, they're only short-term solutions. If you want to have sustainably higher incomes, you actually have to have more productive businesses. There's no other way around it. And there's nowhere in this government PM statement about improving productivity. And that's what the National Party will do. We'll be focused on the things that actually improve the productivity of New Zealand, which is a better skilled workforce. It's improving in quality infrastructure that helps people move their goods to markets. It's about increasing the flow of investment, because it's actually investment that drives improvements in productivity. Then we've got to fight inflation, because inflation is digging into New Zealand families' pockets. That's why on the weekend Christopher Luxon announced the family boost, which will help young families with young kids by putting $75 extra into their household, into their budgets, over $3,000 a year if they're in the right category, Mr. Speaker, because we in the National Party under Chris Luxon is absolutely focused on helping New Zealand families fight inflation. That's why we'll have the Reserve Bank focused on its knitting, which is fighting inflation. We won't waste so much money as the government has, so that's not fueling the fire. We'll be removing the roadblocks such as shortage of workers, and we'll be actually doing the things that matter when it comes finally to law and order, focusing on reducing violent crime, keeping communities safe, and actually doing something about the increase in youth crime and offering new solutions, like particularly that small group of repeat offenders, sending them off to a military academy, getting them their lives sorted out, getting them turned around so that we can live in safety in our community. So, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister mightn't want to look back, but he needs to, and he needs to justify what has this government achieved in 5 years, and I can't think of very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Kuritapu Ellen.
Mr. Speaker, well, first of all, it's a delight to be able to come back to this House and give a contribution in response to the Prime Minister's statement. But first of all, Mr. Speaker, I would be remiss if I didn't just address my friend Paul Goldsmith, the Honourable Paul Goldsmith, and some of his comments. Now, he started out with this incredible picture where he articulated the billions and the billions and the billions. Now, one should remember when he was the former finance spokesperson, that he loved to talk about the billions and the billions and the... In fact, $4.3 billion of a $1 billion fiscal hole. But it was nice to be, I guess, refreshed and remember his efforts when it comes to numbers. Mr. Speaker, he also seemed like, I don't know, maybe it might be a good opportunity for our friends to get out of the little provincial town that is Epsom and come out and see the rest of us in the real world. Because what I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that on the rest of this country is looking to this Labor government. They are looking to this Labor government for what it has delivered for New Zealanders. And, sir, we are talking about the bread and the butter issues, sir. We are talking about the action that we've done with supported parents with health costs by expanding free and low-cost doctor visits to children under 14. Real stuff that helps New Zealanders, sir. We've introduced mental health support into schools, expanded school-based health services across approximately 300 schools, sir. The winter energy payment, your constituents know about it, my constituents know about it, and they all love it, sir. We've increased mean benefits, the family tax credit, student allowances, accommodation supplements, extended paid parental leave to 26 weeks, and the list goes on and on and on. This is a government that delivers. But, sir, I want to just turn my mind to things that have been pressing in our region and across the country generally. And, sir, I guess I commence these part of my remarks alongside my friend, the Honourable Stuart Nash, as Ministers responsible for the recovery of the recent weather events, for myself in Te Tairawhiti, for my friend Stuart in the Hawke's Bay region, sir. Currently in Te Tairawhiti, sir, we have 1,100 people still without access to the rest of the world. I've got 58 local roads that are broken, destroyed, 9 bridges. We have extensive and significant damage all across our farms. We're a food bowl, much like the